But first of all, thanks a lot for attending. I'm delighted to be in Malta talking about graphic design. It's fantastic. Thanks to Louise and Chris for inviting me as well. So the talk, what it says on the tin. So a design dialogue about between three Maltese graphic designers who are related in the same family. My grandfather, my father, and myself. And yeah, they're going to be talking about graphic design. And graphic design it's a tool to explore, research, provoke, reveal, elaborate the world around us. And I believe that the work that the three people that you're going to be seeing, the work that's been produced by the three people you're going to be seeing is about that pretty much. But we've of course worked in different times. Scerri, my granddad, worked between roughly mid-1950s, 54 to roughly 75, maybe even slightly later. Joseph Scerri started in 1970 and still goes on with his work, and myself in the same situation, started in 2002 and still going. So we're going to start with the I would say almost the main man, but yeah, the guy who started it all, Scerri, my grandfather, and here he is in his studio at Crown Cork Works, Hamrun. The only time he worked as full-time designer in a studio. He was mostly a freelancer. Crown Cork Works, for your information, used to produce packaging. It was like a packaging printing company. He headed the artworking studio here. So Scerri's journey starts at the Malta School of Art between 1939-34, just before the war, where he studies technical design with Edward Carwan Dingley, one of Malta's greatest fine artists. Scerri didn't seem, from the work we've seen of his, and thankfully he's not around to hear this, I don't know how he would feel about it, but he didn't seem to be a skilled fine artist. So he sort of, his drawing techniques didn't show that he was a fine artist. He didn't seem to be going into that area. 10 years after the war, the end of the Second World War, where he was drafted with the army, with the British services in Malta, he enrolls on a distance course in commercial art at the London College of Art. He does it from Malta, and in the meantime, Scerri is still employed full-time with the British Admiralty. But Scerri there basically learns commercial art. And commercial art, may I also mention that was the term used for graphic design at the time. If you look at people like Andy Warhol, for example, before he went into fine art, the time that precedes his fine art practice, that was also commercial. He was called a commercial artist, for example. So commercial art precedes graphic design as a term. In 1955, he finishes the course and starts practicing as a freelance commercial artist. Malta is a post-war British colony at the time, rebuilding its economy. Here we can see one of the exercises he did there on this course, where he's learning hand lettering, learning the painful sort of process of going through that. Very close encounter with typography, one of the most important media in graphic design. According to Scerri, there were only 3 people offering freelance commercial art services at this time in Malta. The other 2 besides him were Carmelo Mikallef, known as Il Mike, and Alfredo Gerada. Graphic design as a service was fairly underdeveloped in Malta at the time he was practicing, as opposed, of course, to Europe and North America. At the time, of course, North America was advertising was booming, and it was basically developing. Graphic design was developing, and it was thriving. Same as in Europe. So here are the first pieces of work that he did. And he did a lot of packaging. And he did a lot of packaging for drinks companies. Local drinks companies, may I say, so it gives us an idea what was going on in Malta in the mid-1950s. But his work shows a sort of a modern approach from the outset. It's simple and bold, using simple typography and bold solid colors, as we're seeing here. Minimalistic, sharp illustrations. He addressed the need to communicate a message simply, in a simple manner, using iconography. He worked a lot, as I said, in the packaging field. So here, I mean, this is one of my favorite pieces where we're seeing as well really beautiful use of type. And as well, the mid-century modern is moving in here. It's still not the style there yet, but it's you can see that typography sort of really moving into there. It didn't just work for drinks companies. He did labels for as well as we're seeing mosquito and cockroaches, fly killer services, and also talcum powder, a label which has survived the time, so it's still around and you can see it. Salvo Scerri did work for clients who are still around. Golden Harvest, Malta's one of the Malta's main bakeries, commercial bakeries, and here you can see the mid-century modern sort of solid shapes, solid colors, very sharp typography coming in, and it's quite evident here. Worked for Marsovin, another big local client, and again that's still around, and this work got him a mention in quite a prominent journal, design journal of the time, a British journal, Art and Industry. I don't think it's still around. And here we're talking about 1956, and even like it's interesting to see like the sort of the colonial speak here, which is quite interesting. Malta's still a colonial sort of island, and there's like the past pupil of the Malta School of Art and St. Albert Central School. Malta SP Scerri is now pursuing an active career as freelance commercial artist in the George Cross Island. But the wine labels above, each in 3 colors, are examples of his work in the packaging field. So he immediately sort of went quite into it and got exposure from it. And I think as well, Salvo Scerri, most of his teaching came as well, besides the formal teaching that he got, was by being interested in what was going on, looking at these journals, and I'm sure he got quite a lot out of these. He worked freelance with big advertising agencies that were set up in Malta at the time, like BPC. And BPC was set up during the British times and had ties with the British, but it also set up by Maltese individuals. And here they used to handle big clients, big British clients that we can see here, like Vauxhall. He did advertising for Vauxhall in 1963, appeared in the Times of Malta here. And also packaging, some packaging ideas or concepts for Singer sewing machines. So, so his work is also reaching that edge. As a graphic designer, he needs to self-promote himself, or like any designer. And this is a classic piece of his Christmas card he sent out to his clients that shows that graphic style. It's very graphic, very bold. So I think when you see Salvo Scerri's work, you can really see hardcore graphic design work, proper sort of pure, straightforward work. Through looking at his work, you can also see the deconstruction of how the anatomy of an artwork used to be at the time. And for example, here he used to work with tradesmen who were in Britain. He used to send the artworks blocks. At the time, letterpress was the most common printing technique in Malta, and he used to send artworks and blocks away to be made and then send back to Malta and then used in the artwork for clients. And then he used to basically work with the printer to assemble these. And here you can see, so in this specific case, like fine line blocks, one combined line and tone block. So it is pretty much what you're seeing. There's a finished piece. It's deconstructed there. And here in this case, it's somebody from Middlesbrough, Hood and Co., who he worked with. Also, may I mention that Salvo Scerri worked with a lot of Maltese printers at the time, like I would say Union Press, Bonavia, printers of Slima, Clear Type Press of Valletta. Bonavia Press is still around, but the other two printers, Union Press, I think is still around, as far as I believe. Clear Type Press, unfortunately, great name, but it's actually folded as far as I know. So on that idea of the anatomy of the artwork, you can see from concept to separation to finished piece, concept drawings, refined drawings, separations, finished pieces. So it really gives you a good sort of deconstruction of how he used to work at the time. Work for national clients. In this case here we're seeing work he did with MPS, another agency, which was set up during the British times, which is still around, of course. And here he's doing a national project about transport, Malta transport advertising, and I think this could be an early example here of infographics done at the time. It shows the island and connectability through transport. So it's quite interesting to see that. So this is a leaflet. Trade fair, 1960s again, and mid-century modern again. I mean, here you can see the influences of what was going on in the rest of Europe in terms of design. The bold solid colors, the sans serif type, and it shows Malta pretty much opening up to the world. The economy was booming post-war, and it was sort of Malta projecting its image out to the rest of the world pretty much here. So this work really provides an interesting snapshot of what was going on in Malta at the time. Now, okay, so this is where I would say when things get interesting and a bit controversial. In 1962, I'm not going to do a history lesson, but I'm just going to give you a bit of context about what was going on. But in 1962, Malta witnessed a harshly fought general election, and this was marred by a toxic conflict between the Maltese Church and the Labour Party. In the midst of Malta also fighting for its independence. Labour treated church and state separately in its manifesto, amongst other things. And the church didn't like that, of course. The church, it meant that it would lose its grip on power if Labour got elected in that election. So the church set up a militant task force called the Junta Diocesana, which even itself shows that sense, basically to lobby against the Labour Party in the election, and the Labour Party ended up losing and this election, and it also paved the way for independence in 1964 as well. So just a short sort of context about that. But basically, Salvo Scerri was roped into by the junta into designing a campaign to encourage voters not to vote for the socialists. Here you can see some of the posters that were out at the time to campaign against the church, to campaign against the Labour Party. And you can see the top two posters on the left corner are Salvo Scerri's, and we'll talk about that shortly. And that is the final leaflet that came out after the election was won. And you can see the language is quite harsh. Allah Manor Bahna, which is God is with us, and we've won it. So there is this very sort of vociferous, sort of very, very harsh sort of approach. Here you can see Salvo Scerri's, you can see sort of the visual language, the symbolism being used, and how he was briefed, and how he wanted to paint the Socialist Party at the time. So these sort of dehumanization of politics in a way, and how basically he could put off with his message making voters to not to vote, basically. And then here you have the first leaflets. This was I would say the slogan says it all here, Minubla, that's my votage. Those who cannot think, I would say, or headless, wouldn't vote. And it says stop and vote for the junta. And then here we can see some interesting typographic work at the back of the leaflet. That was, of course, this is the rough, and this would have been on the other side as a final printed piece. So, they also made stamps out of it, so it was quite a fully fledged campaign. And then leads us to this piece, which is probably the last, as far as you know, is the last surviving poster from this campaign that we have in our private collection, in the rest of the archives, because we have collected an archive of this work. And here, this basically is showing probably one of Scerri's finest in terms of use of symbolism and graphic communication. Probably fairly groundbreaking work in the history of Malta's poster art, or even Malta's poster political activism in a way, visually. But I mean, even the symbolism is interesting. The idea of comparing the dragon, which is in Catholic symbolism, is compared to Satan, of course. And here he is putting the Labour Party of the time as being sort of this ultimate enemy of the church. And the message is fairly clear. So it's really strong graphic design, and it's fairly straightforward, I would say. So that's Salvo Scerri. Salvo Scerri sort of ended his career sort of late 70s, I would say, but 75-ish. So moving on. The next person is, of course, Salvo Scerri's son and my dad, Joseph Scerri. And here we're in the 80s now. So we've moved And here he is, Joe Scerri, in his studio at Rousman and Brigden's in Toronto. Joe basically started drawing at a very young age. Apparently, at school, he used to draw football club sheets for friends. He continued to draw. He continued to develop his drawing skills under tutorship of Tony Patch, an established ballet artist and art teacher. He helped his father, Salvo, in his studio regularly. So he also developed an idea of commercial art and this process via his father. So there was that crossover and passing on, I guess. But after high school, he joined Salvo Scerri at Crown Cork Works. So at the end of service, there's that crossover. And here you can see Crown Cork Works, which was, as I said earlier, this packaging printing company. And they had silkscreen, tin printing, print down frames, everything. So it was quite a fully fledged business. Here he learned silkscreen and other printing techniques. In these formative years, he did small freelance jobs while working for different local printers, which eventually landed him his first full-time job in 1979 as a graphic designer with Perfecta, which was an advertising agency. I don't know if Perfecta is still around, but possibly it is. Possibly, I would say. So at that time, graphic design the demand for graphic design increased. Of course, the economy was booming generally, or the economy was sort of moving on. But here we can see some of Joe Scerri's concept drafts, which show he's more of a skilled, I would say, artist and illustrator compared to Salvo Scerri. This is how designers used to print concepts and provide art direction for photographers. You needed to have drawing skills to work as a graphic designer at the time. So here you can see this a campaign for Malta. The use of markers, which was quite common at the time. And here, I mean, the layout which showing instructions or direction for photographers how to sort of how their work needs to be shot and how it would fit in the layout pretty much. And here, a watercolor illustration, which was actually incorporated in the artwork itself. In 1982, Joe Scerri decided to move to Canada with my mom and my sister, and it's there where his career reaches new heights. He is employed by one of the best studios in Toronto, Rousman and Brigden's. Here is a self-promo publication for the studio, which Joe designed later on in his time at Rousman and Brigden's. Here are actually some of his colleagues who he always mentions, like Jim Taylor, who was a big art director in the studio, who he learned a lot from. And this was a proper self-promotional publication. Here, Scerri is introduced to corporate design and the annual report. And he works for a number of high-profile clients, including Canada's Ministry of Energy and Westinghouse. Westinghouse, of course, whose identity is designed by the great Paul Rand, who is the father of American modernist graphic design. And it must have been great for Joe Scerri to work with such a fantastic piece of work. Bit of a water break, because I'm parched. You can see the layout of the Westinghouse annual report here, grids of type, 80s style photography, quite art directed. And here's another annual report, which was for CCL, which was a big packaging company at the time and internationally. In 1987, the family decides to move back to Malta. They got homesick and they decided to move back to the island, where Joe Scerri immediately finds work with promotion services. At the time, a small advertising agency. With Scerri's experience with corporate design, promotion services starts pitching for annual report work for major clients in Malta. And it's here that Joe Scerri establishes himself as one of the best graphic designers on the island. He produces concept-driven art-directed work in collaboration with local photographers for Malta Freeport in this case, and Malta International Airport. And you can see sort of the styles being adapted to the concepts, different concepts and ideas that each annual report had in it. Following the success, promotion services decide to tap into the publication market, the book market, and they become high-end book publishers, and they became Miranda Books, which was like a separate arm of promotion service. And here, Scerri art directs a series of Joe Scerri art directs a series of new Militensia publications, which you can still see around, I'm sure, about Malta's major historical cities, Valletta. This one is about Mdina and the three cities, as well as London. They produced a London 360 publication. The publications feature his layout with pen and ink, illustrations, and great photography. You can see the pen and ink illustrations, which reinstate the skill, the illustrative skill that Joe had. I would say, as compared to Salvo Scerri, I would say so. Quite established and refined work. After promotion services, he moved on to another studio, Mass Communications, where he worked still worked on publication work, besides other graphic design work, but he retained his direction and publication. And one of the biggest projects he worked on there is a compendium of Norbert Attart's work, installation work. And ironically as well, Norbert Attart was one of the most prolific graphic designers in Malta in the 1970s. So there is a bit of graphic design history there with Norbert. But yeah, this book, I See Red Everywhere, was also the first book to be printed via computer-to-plate process in Malta. So it has a bit of printing history about it. Proud Floriana people, both my dad and my granddad, and this was a way of them returning, or my dad returning, Joe Scerri returning to Floriana, a book about St. Publius Church, the parish church of Floriana, which was designed in collaboration with the Floriana Gazette. And again, on the same lines of Militensia, the specialism carries on here, and it shows basically this historical church throughout this publication. I would say, being a corporate design specialist, obviously, he handled visual identity projects, and these visual identity projects involve logo design, mark making, or mark design. Not mark making is another thing, but yeah, sometimes we call them marks or logos. But quite a range of them across the years, and as I think many graphic designers who work in Malta, they have to deal with the 8-pointed cross at some point in their life, and in this case, Joe Scerri took on the challenge at the early 90s, I would say, with the Malta Development Corporation on the right, where he's trying to show this 8-pointed cross flying, shooting off, and developing pretty much into something else. And also here, I remember him explaining how this flag, sort of maritime Malta idea, was done DIY with a photocopier, which you do nowadays, but that at the time had to be done because there was no computers at the time, so this was all handmade. Of course, later on the years, more work, and I think this is one of my favorites he did. I think it's a bit of a visual checkmate, in my opinion. It's quite clear. This is for the Mosta Technopark, which I think the identity has changed since then, unfortunately. But it shows this idea of harnessing the Mosta Dome, the lights, the hands, the buildings, holding everything together. So it's one solid unit, really clearly communicating what the Mosta Technopark was really about. A few more, one of them being a pitch for the Mater Dei identity, which wasn't taken, of course, with the top left. Interesting, more logos for example, Bag Graphics. Bag Graphics is like a print paper merchant, print supplier, and there's this lovely idea of the BNG sort of as printing cylinders merging into each other. So there's a lot of typographic play, as we're seeing here in the heirloom furniture identity. Lastly, with Joe Scerri's work, same as his father, he went into packaging design throughout his time. He did packaging design throughout all his time as a graphic designer, but I think in the later years he did some fairly big jobs for big clients in Malta, and this was done at Mass Communications for Delicata winemaker or winemakers, and this was the rebranding of the Medina Vineyards range, and of course the Great Grand Cavalier wine that Delicata produces. And then finally as well, worked of course with a big drinks giant, Farsons, with BPC here. Again, so the crossovers, at this time Joe Scerri was working with BPC, and the crossovers are that Salvo worked with BBC, Joe worked with BBC, and so I guess it's a small island as well, so you get to sort of work with similar sort of companies. But this was a rebrand for Hopleaf and their Blue Label beers. Okay, oh, there's me. So now we're in 2002. So 2002. So that's where I started, and yeah, this leads to my work. And here's me in my studio in Glasgow. Yeah, with the studio I've just moved into with my friend and collaborator Daniele Sambo, who's a Venetian photographer, and we work together on projects, on books, etc. So he took this picture actually in the last minute. I was panicking. Oh, how am I going to take a picture of me in the studio? Try and keep everything together. So, of course, my induction into graphic design happened through my father. I have been lucky to be surrounded by designers from a very young age. If that's luck, actually, I'm not sure it's lucky to be surrounded by designers sometimes, neurotic beings. But yeah, joking apart, it is great to be in design. From time to time, my dad used to take me to the studio after school, where I would see the work being produced. I still remember those pen and ink drawings being on his drawing board in Slema with promotion services. But my formal design education started at MCAST. Across a 4-year period, I did foundation program there. I did graphic design at HND, HNC. But before MCAST, actually, more importantly, I spent 2 summers working with Bonavia printers in Slema, where I developed printing plates and assisted with letterpress and offset lithographic printing, which was great to be in a printing press that my grandfather actually worked in. So again, the crossovers happen again, and I'm back to where my family has been. While at MCAS, I was also on a long-term internship with Manjana Lightfoot, where I learned a great deal about graphic design and studio life. That was great to have that as part of my teaching at MCAS. My father, though, obviously remained my main mentor and tutor throughout my time. So this takes me to my first project, my first major project in design, and that was I think it was my foundation project. I can't remember, it was a graphic designer pathway sort of project, but it was still one of my favorite projects because it was playful, it was my way into type, it was my way into photography, and these are things which I still love about design and about what I do. But it was quite a story. It was the A to Z of family planning, it was called. A and Z come to the world. In this sort of love-filled environment, love is in the air, sunshine. They actually get busy, so there's a bit of typographic sex going on there. A and Z actually have an egg between them, and it contains all the letters between A and Z in the alphabet. So what happens is all the letters between A and Z are fired into the world, and they meet the world around them. And part of that world is also our local veg vendor, Jesmond, who allowed me to place my type amongst his fresh fruit. And I remember also an unfortunate incident with my goldfish, which didn't survive the photo shoot after this, which wasn't great. But I cannot say no animals were harmed in this project. So, following 2 years of editorial design at the Times of Malta newspaper, I moved to Edinburgh 2007 to study graphic design at Edinburgh College of Art. That's when my design education took a new high, of course, and it was life-changing. It was a life-changing experience in terms of culture, how design is tackled, the people I met there, the resources available. It was great. So I kept working with photography, and but also started looking at artist books and how these two media could be combined. I started looking at the role of the graphic designer beyond the service-based role, working without a client to your own brief, using your own voice pretty much. So it was a bit of a move from how my predecessors worked in their time as well. I was also developing an interesting relationship between art and design, how the two mingle and cross over each other, and started looking at themes as I was doing here, such as identity, non-places, surveillance. So that was something I wanted to explore through the skills I had at the time. And this is a publication I did when I was a student at Edinburgh College of Art. So it's always the idea, working with photography, but also using a graphic format to contain that, the book in this case. After that time, I went back to Malta after Edinburgh, and I spent 2 years back in Malta and followed in my father's footsteps and worked for Miranda on militancy publications. It was a great experience. I worked on a big project there, which was the co-cathedral, the book about the co-cathedral of St. John, which I didn't actually put in this presentation, but I felt it was something that, of course, was a great experience for me. It also carried on for me to the longevity or the continuity with working with publications. After 2 years, I got tired again of being in Malta, and I decided, hey, it's time for me to go back to Scotland. I love the weather so much, I decided to move, and Glasgow School of Art followed this time. The mighty Glasgow School of Art. Had a great time there. It was a 1-year course where I developed further the ideas I started at ECA. So again, looking at the graphic designer as a multidisciplined practitioner who takes on multiple roles to communicate a story. In this case, it was design as journalism as well. Here I approached the tourney, of course, story of human migration, and I looked at it beyond the narrative being said by the media and by politicians in a shelter in Halfar, run by a Franciscan friar. And that for me was a great experience, because it is looking at how to sort of pretty much frame what you do to something that is very important. And I think design needs to be in these areas. Here I worked as a photographer, as a photojournalist pretty much. And I documented the island, coming back home, looking at it through the context of the story, and hearing the stories of people who have reached our island in not great circumstances, I would say. The project was this master's project, because it was for a master's course. It was fairly expanded. It was on web, it was on film, but also it was as a publication on a newsprint format, which I did. And this is, again, me working with graphic design, multiple media, and putting them together in one space. And Distant Land basically showed the images, told the story through the images, but also as well sort of put the arguments put by locals and put by migrants themselves. So it sort of put these elements together through design. As a project, got quite a lot of exposure, including, of course, the degree shows you at an art school in the UK at the end, but also it was quite widely available in Glasgow in terms of distribution. Reaching the last two projects, couple of big projects followed this time. This was a memorable one due to its subject, spiritualism in Stoke-on-Trent. Who would think that you would deal with that sometimes? But yeah, myself and Daniele worked with a team of ethnographers from the Open University. They were working on a big project that aimed to map the history of spiritualism in Stoke-on-Trent. Apparently, Stoke-on-Trent was a big hub for spiritualist practice. So we're talking spiritualism, seances, etc. So it was quite an interesting subject to deal with. That was the initial research that I would have documented to sort of look at this. These guys, of course, wanted to make an exhibition, make a publication. They wanted to visualize the research. This was the start for me to start looking at work like this, which I love, because you get really immersed in a subject. It's not like a quick client exchange. You really spend time and go to these places. These were Daniele's shots, who was documenting another side of Stoke, where he was looking at churches that used to be spiritualist temples, if you could call them, which are now either bookshops or nightclubs. So it was quite a great project. Something quite funny happened in this project. We were asked to go to a seance, and as part to be polite with the subject matter. And apparently, I got contacted by Spirit, and guess whose spirit that was? It was Salvo Scerri. So I don't believe about spiritualism, but it was a very weird experience, because she was very precise about it. She didn't guess she was a graphic designer. She didn't mention that, but she mentioned other things which were quite remarkable. So this is quite an interesting long exposure shot by Dan, showing this sort of spiritual sort of being in this room. The guys wanted to title this event as Talking with the Dead, which we thought, whoa, this is a little bit too straight, punch in your face. But we tested it in the case room we have in the studio. We have a shared case room, which is quite a great resource. We're very lucky with that in Glasgow. And yeah, and we thought, this doesn't work, but how about this? And this involved designing a visual identity pretty much for the full project that used still Talking with the Dead as a secondary sort of software sort of identity system, but the focus was more in the center about the actual title of the second title of the exhibition. But the two worked separately, and that was what was versatile as a project. And basically here you're seeing the publications we designed for this project. We had two publications. One of them was a photo publication, which was Daniela's work. And the second one was more of a research publication that showed the sort of workings behind the scene of the project. My last project on this talk is all about, it started with play, which I think we can never underestimate the value of play in design. Doing without thinking, and just testing things. And this was, at the time I was doing a residency in the case room at the studio, and I remember the letterpress technician who was in at the time was talking about what do you want to do? I thought, okay, at the moment I'm reading about the whole ODZ situation in Malta and basically the snapping up of land on the island. And I thought, okay, I'll play with ODZ as letters, and I'll crop them and I'll play with them. It remained as a series of prints, but later on it actually made its way into a project. And this was a publication I started with a group of ex-graduates at Glasgow School of Art, ex-photography graduates, and we decided to do this journal called Notes, a critical journal about photography in Scotland and beyond. And the idea of it is that it's a letter to photography. So what does a letter look like in graphic terms? It looks pretty much similar to that. Also, it's about Scottish photography, so there's the salt art thing, which is a bit maybe an obvious reference, which I try to avoid, but I sort of semi-avoided it. But it's also, this symbolizes the frame waiting to take content, waiting to take image. And then when you put notes together, it takes me back to the experiment and gives me an identity system that could work for this. The idea for this was it would work on its own as a logo, but it would also, most importantly, it would need to work on the most important part of this project, which is the cover of the journal. And the system was quite flexible, and we with the photography we were dealing with, it really was ideal. And I think this, to this date, is one of my favorite projects. As I said, it features Scottish photographers, Scottish artists, in this case James Pfaff, who just had a big exhibition as part of the Glasgow International, just in April there. But also we were lucky to work with very big names. We made contact with some very big artists like Sophie Calendar Galleries, who allowed us to work with their images and write reviews about them, and people like Robert Frank. So somebody like myself who loves photography, this was a great project to be on. Lastly, part of my practice is teaching. I've been teaching at Edinburgh College of Art. I went back to this art school 5 years ago. And I can say that's one of my, I love teaching because I love that two-way sort of dialogue with students where you learn from each other and you share ideas. And I think you feel a certain sense of responsibility that you are contributing to new generations, new ways of thinking. So teaching has also been like difficult and challenging. The current climate in art and design institutions and universities in the UK is not fantastic, but it's that passion for the subject that really drives you to do this. So so I want to end the talk with a couple of questions to pose, maybe for the Q&A, which my father Joe will be joining. Seeing at this subject, we talk about history, we talk about Malta's design history, Malta's graphic design history. What is it? Is it documented? Is it somewhere? Do we have a record of it? I'm not sure about that. We are trying to start something with Salvo Scerri's work. And does it matter? When you don't see design history being documented, what does that say about a country, about its cultural heritage? Does it value design? And I think that could be an interesting discussion point that stems from this, I would say. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.